The Lazy Man's Guide to 2026. Stop chasing everything. Before we begin, take a quiet moment to settle into stillness, because what you are about to hear may challenge everything you have been taught about ambition, productivity, and what it truly means to build a meaningful life. For a long time, many of us have lived under the silent pressure to know everything, pursue everything, and master everything, believing that success belonged only to those who moved the fastest and carried the most weight. Yet very few people stop to ask what that constant striving is actually costing them internally. There comes a stage in life when your tiredness is no longer physical, but deeply mental, when your thoughts feel overcrowded, your attention is fragmented, and despite doing everything that once looked like progress, your inner world begins to feel strangely overwhelmed. You may still be functioning, still achieving, still showing up, but internally, you are stretched thin. The psychologist Herbert Simon once said, "A wealth of information creates a poverty of attention." And perhaps nowhere is this more visible than in the modern ambitious individual, who believes they must remain knowledgeable about everything, present in every conversation, responsive to every opportunity, and endlessly adaptable in a world that never stops accelerating. At first, this pursuit feels responsible, even admirable, until one day you realize that trying to keep up with everything is exactly what is draining the life out of you. Many people reach this realization the hard way, sometimes through burnout, sometimes through emotional fatigue, and sometimes through success that feels far less fulfilling than they imagined it would. Before we continue, take a quiet moment to subscribe to this channel and become part of a growing circle of listeners who are choosing depth over noise and wisdom over urgency, because as this space continues to expand, those who joined early will always be remembered as the original guests whose presence helped shape its direction. Author Cal Newport, known for his work on deep concentration, argues that the ability to focus without distraction is becoming increasingly rare in our world, and therefore increasingly valuable, which means that those who learn to guard their attention will possess an advantage far greater than talent alone. Imagine what begins to shift when you stop scattering your energy across dozens of competing priorities. Your thinking deepens. Your creativity strengthens. Your emotional reactivity softens. You stop living in constant response mode and begin moving with intention. There is an old story about a woodcutter who spent hours striking a tree with a dull blade, growing more exhausted with every swing, until a passerby suggested he pause to sharpen the axe, only for the woodcutter to reply that he was too busy chopping to stop. Many ambitious lives are built on this exact misunderstanding, mistaking relentless effort for effective progress. But intelligence is not measured by how hard you can push, or by how much you can endure. It is measured by how wisely you can choose. As you move toward 2026, consider the possibility that your life does not need more force. It may need more clarity, more boundaries, more courage to step away from what is unnecessary, because the future will not belong to the person who tries to be everywhere. It will belong to the person who knows exactly where they should be. Leonardo da Vinci once wrote, "Simplicity is the ultimate sophistication." And perhaps one of the most sophisticated decisions you will ever make is learning to simplify your commitments, your ambitions, and even your definition of success. Sometimes growth begins the moment you release the pressure to do it all. Sometimes wisdom looks suspiciously like laziness to a world addicted to speed. But what the world calls laziness is often nothing more than strategic restraint, the quiet discipline of refusing what does not align so you can give your fullest presence to what does. You do not have to attend every argument. You do not have to pursue every opportunity. You do not have to master every skill. Because your life expands most powerfully not when you add more, but when you finally become brave enough to subtract. And in that subtraction, something unexpected begins to emerge. Space. Space to think. space to breathe, space to rediscover what actually matters to you beneath the noise of expectation. The philosopher Blaise Pascal once suggested that many of humanity's problems stem from our inability to sit quietly in a room alone, and while the world has changed dramatically since his time, this insight feels even more relevant now, in an era where silence is constantly interrupted by notifications competing for fragments of your attention. Yet clarity has always preferred quiet environments. So let this be the year you stop confusing motion with meaning, the year you trade urgency for intention, and the year you finally recognize that your worth was never meant to be proven through exhaustion. Because you do not have to do everything to become everything you are capable of being. Sometimes the smartest life you can build is not the busiest one, but the most intentional. There is a quiet moment that often arrives in the life of an emotionally exhausted person, although it rarely announces itself dramatically, and more often feels like a subtle internal pause in which you begin to sense that the way you have been living, giving, responding, and enduring can no longer continue unchanged without costing you something essential. It is not always a breakdown. Sometimes it is simply a morning when getting out of bed feels heavier than usual, even though nothing catastrophic has occurred, or an evening when the thought of answering another message feels disproportionately draining, prompting a question that had previously remained buried beneath momentum: why does everything feel like so much? For many capable individuals, this question is quickly dismissed, because competence has trained them to override discomfort rather than investigate it, yet ignored signals rarely disappear. Instead, they accumulate, quietly gathering weight until the psyche can no longer carry them unnoticed. The psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, reflecting on human endurance, wrote that between stimulus and response there exists a space, and within that space lies our power to choose. And although Frankl spoke primarily about meaning, his insight applies equally to emotional exhaustion, because the moment you pause long enough to examine your internal state, you begin reclaiming authorship over a life that may have been running on inherited expectations rather than conscious design. One of the most misunderstood aspects of emotional fatigue is that it often intensifies precisely when a person is functioning well enough to appear unaffected, since external success can mask internal depletion with remarkable effectiveness. You continue meeting deadlines. You continue showing up. You continue solving problems. And because nothing has visibly collapsed, neither you nor those around you immediately recognize that your energy is no longer being replenished at the rate it is being spent. This is why many emotionally exhausted individuals describe their experience not as falling apart, but as slowly thinning, as though their inner world has been stretched across too many responsibilities without sufficient return. There is an illuminating concept within psychology known as decision fatigue, explored extensively by social psychologist Roy Baumeister, who demonstrated that the human capacity for decision-making is not infinite but diminishes with repeated use, meaning that the countless small choices you make throughout the day quietly tax the same cognitive reservoir required for creativity, patience, and emotional regulation. When that reservoir runs low, even simple matters begin to feel disproportionately demanding, and you may find yourself postponing tasks not because you lack discipline but because your mental circuitry is asking, quite intelligently, for restoration. Yet in cultures that equate constant output with virtue, this natural depletion is frequently misinterpreted as personal failure, leading many people to double their effort precisely when what they most require is strategic recovery. Consider how often you have pushed through tiredness believing that perseverance alone would carry you safely forward, unaware that endurance without renewal eventually transforms from strength into strain. The writer John O'Donohue once observed that the human soul is not mechanical and cannot be forced into continuous performance without consequence, suggesting that our deepest vitality emerges not from relentless activity but from rhythmic engagement with both effort and stillness. If you reflect honestly, you may recognize that some of the heaviest seasons of your life were not those in which you worked hardest, but those in which you felt unable to step away, unable to say no, unable even to imagine a version of success that did not require constant proving. Proving is exhausting work. It demands that you continually demonstrate your worth rather than inhabit it. And whenever worth must be demonstrated without pause, rest begins to feel undeserved, which is perhaps one of the quiet tragedies of modern ambition. The leadership thinker Simon Sinek once remarked that working hard for something we do not care about is called stress, while working hard for something we love is called passion, yet even passion requires boundaries if it is to remain life-giving rather than life-consuming. Emotional exhaustion frequently emerges when passion becomes entangled with obligation, when what once energized you gradually transforms into something you feel unable to step away from without guilt. Guilt, however, is rarely a reliable guide, because it often arises not from wrongdoing but from the simple act of disappointing expectations that were never meant to govern your entire life. Pause for a moment and consider how many expectations you carry that were never consciously chosen by you. Expectations about success timelines, availability, emotional labor, responsiveness, achievement, all absorbed gradually until they began to feel indistinguishable from your own desires. The philosopher Michel de Montaigne warned centuries ago that the greatest thing in the world is to know how to belong to oneself, yet belonging to oneself becomes extraordinarily difficult when your energy has been distributed everywhere except inward. Emotional exhaustion, then, is not merely about tiredness. It is often about estrangement from the self, a quiet drifting away from your own center as your attention is repeatedly pulled outward. And yet, within this recognition lies profound hope, because what has drifted can be returned, and what has been overextended can be gathered again with care. Imagine for a moment that your life is less like a machine designed for endless production and more like a landscape requiring stewardship, where certain fields must periodically lie fallow so that future harvests remain possible. No farmer would condemn the soil for needing rest, yet many people condemn themselves for the same biological wisdom. There is an extraordinary gentleness in recognizing that your fatigue may not be an obstacle to overcome but a message inviting you toward a more sustainable way of living. The author Parker Palmer wrote that self-care is never a selfish act but simply good stewardship of the only gift you have, the gift you were put on earth to offer others, and when viewed through this lens, caring for your energy becomes not indulgence but responsibility. Perhaps this is the moment to release the harsh narrative that has followed you, the one insisting that if you were stronger, more disciplined, or more driven, you would not feel this way. Strength is not the absence of limits. Strength is the wisdom to honor them. There comes a turning point in the life of many emotionally exhausted individuals when they begin to understand that continuing at the same pace is no longer admirable but unsustainable, and that what once looked like resilience may actually have been prolonged self-abandonment. This realization can feel unsettling at first, because it asks you to reconsider identities you have worn for years, the dependable one, the tireless one, the strong one. Yet identity is not meant to imprison you. It is meant to evolve as your understanding deepens. Psychologist Erik Erikson, known for his work on human development, emphasized that growth involves continual renegotiation of the self, suggesting that who you were required to be in one chapter of life may not be who you are called to be in the next. So allow yourself to consider, gently, that the version of you who carried everything may have been necessary once, but may no longer be sustainable now. And this is not regression. It is maturation. Because maturity is not measured by how much you can endure without complaint, but by how honestly you can respond to the truth of your inner experience. As this understanding begins to settle, something subtle yet powerful often occurs. Permission. Permission to pause without justification. Permission to need without apology. Permission to exist without constant performance. It is within permission that energy begins, slowly, to return. Not all at once, and not dramatically, but in small, reassuring increments that remind you vitality was never truly lost, only buried beneath excess demand. You may notice that when you protect even a small portion of your time, your thinking clears slightly, your patience lengthens, your emotional world softens, and what once felt overwhelming becomes, if not easy, at least navigable again. The neuroscientist Daniel Siegel describes integration as the process through which different aspects of the mind come into harmonious relationship, and emotional restoration is precisely this, the gradual reweaving of parts of yourself that were stretched too far apart. Let us move now toward a question both simple and transformative. What would change if you stopped treating rest as something you must earn, and began treating it as something that makes meaningful effort possible? Because effort unsupported by restoration eventually collapses, whereas effort paired with renewal becomes resilient. There is a quiet courage required to step out of cycles that once defined you, especially when those cycles were praised, yet courage is not always loud. Sometimes it looks like declining an invitation, postponing a demand, or allowing yourself an unscheduled evening without interpreting it as failure. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, a new relationship with your energy begins to form, one grounded not in endless proving but in thoughtful stewardship. You start asking different questions, not "how much can I handle?" but "what is worthy of my handling?" Not "how far can I push?" but "what pace allows me to remain whole?" These questions are not signs of reduced ambition. They are signs of intelligent ambition. Because the future will not belong to those who burn the brightest for the shortest time, but to those who learn how to remain illuminated without consuming themselves. As we continue forward, we will explore how emotionally exhausted individuals rebuild their internal strength without abandoning their aspirations, how boundaries transform from frightening into liberating, and how a quieter, more intentional form of success often leads not to less achievement but to deeper fulfillment. For now, remain here with this emerging understanding, allowing it to settle gently rather than forcing immediate change, because sustainable transformation rarely arrives through sudden upheaval but through steady, compassionate recalibration. And perhaps, as these reflections linger, you will begin to sense that what you once called laziness was never a flaw in your character, but an intelligent signal from within, a signal guiding you toward a life that is not only productive, but profoundly livable. There is a profound shift that begins to occur once a person fully understands that their exhaustion is not a personal defect but an intelligent signal, because understanding alters posture, and posture alters the way you move through your life even before any external circumstances have changed. For a long time, you may have lived as though your energy were an endlessly renewable resource, something to be spent generously without the need for deliberate replenishment, yet the human system has never functioned this way, no matter how convincingly modern culture suggests otherwise. Every living organism operates through rhythm, through expansion followed by restoration, through output balanced by renewal, and whenever this rhythm is ignored, strain inevitably replaces vitality. The tragedy is not that people become tired, because tiredness is part of being alive, but that so many interpret their tiredness as evidence that something is wrong with them rather than evidence that something in their way of living requires gentler calibration. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke once advised that we must learn to live the questions rather than rush prematurely toward answers, and emotional exhaustion is one of those questions, inviting you not into self-criticism but into deeper curiosity about the architecture of your life. What exactly has been consuming you? Where has your energy been flowing without sufficient return? And perhaps most importantly, which parts of your exhaustion belong to genuine responsibility, and which parts belong to patterns you inherited without ever consciously agreeing to sustain them? These questions are not meant to destabilize you. Rather, they are meant to return you to authorship, because exhaustion often flourishes wherever authorship has been quietly surrendered. Many people discover, upon reflection, that they have been living according to scripts written by urgency rather than intention, responding to expectations so automatically that they rarely paused long enough to ask whether those expectations were aligned with the life they genuinely wished to inhabit. The psychologist William James, often called the father of American psychology, wrote that the greatest discovery of his generation was that human beings can alter their lives by altering their attitudes of mind, and although this statement is frequently quoted, its depth is sometimes overlooked. Because altering one's attitude requires the courage to see clearly before choosing differently. Seeing clearly, however, can feel unsettling at first, particularly if your identity has long been intertwined with being dependable, accommodating, and strong. Strength is a beautiful quality, yet strength without boundaries slowly transforms into overextension. Much like a bridge designed to carry a certain weight eventually weakens if burdened beyond its capacity. Imagine, for a moment, that your energy is not simply something you possess but something entrusted to you, something requiring stewardship rather than endless expenditure, and consider how differently you might live if protecting that energy were viewed not as selfishness but as wisdom. The author Annie Dillard once observed that how we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives, and if your days have been structured around constant responsiveness, it is only natural that your life may begin to feel more reactive than intentional. Yet intentionality is recoverable, often through changes so modest that they might initially appear insignificant, though their cumulative effect can be quietly transformative. One of the earliest signs of emotional restoration is the willingness to pause before agreeing, to allow space between request and response rather than collapsing instantly into compliance, because within that pause lies discernment, and discernment is one of the most protective forms of intelligence a person can cultivate. It is not necessary to withdraw from your responsibilities in order to reclaim your energy. Rather, it is often enough to engage them more consciously, asking not only whether something is good, but whether it is good for you in this season of your life. Seasons matter, although modern ambition frequently pretends otherwise, encouraging a uniform pace that disregards the natural fluctuations of human capacity. The writer Ecclesiastes, in language both ancient and enduring, reminds us that there is a time for every purpose under heaven, suggesting that wisdom lies partly in recognizing which time you are inhabiting rather than forcing yourself into rhythms that no longer fit. Perhaps you are entering a season not of acceleration but of recalibration, a season in which your deepest work is not to do more but to realign what you do with the person you are becoming. Recalibration is rarely dramatic. Instead, it often unfolds through quiet decisions that gradually reshape the emotional climate of your days. You might begin by noticing where your energy feels respected and where it feels routinely depleted, because environments speak, even when no words are exchanged, and your nervous system is always listening. The psychiatrist Carl Rogers emphasized the importance of congruence, the state in which your outer life reflects your inner truth, and emotional exhaustion frequently signals a gap between these two realities, a gap that can no longer be maintained without cost. Closing that gap does not require perfection, only honesty. Honesty about what you can carry. Honesty about what you can no longer carry. Honesty about what was never yours to carry in the first place. There is immense relief in this honesty, although relief is sometimes preceded by discomfort, particularly if you have long equated worth with availability. Yet worth that depends upon constant availability is inherently unstable, because it leaves no room for the solitude from which clarity emerges. The philosopher Hannah Arendt once wrote that solitude is the place where we become fully present to ourselves, and it is often in solitude that emotionally exhausted individuals rediscover desires they had postponed, curiosities they had muted, and forms of rest they had quietly denied themselves. Rest, however, is not merely the absence of work. It is the presence of conditions that allow your inner life to breathe again. For some, rest looks like unstructured time. For others, it looks like creative expression, long walks, fewer obligations, deeper conversations, or simply the radical permission to exist without performing usefulness for a while. What matters is not the form rest takes, but the message it conveys to your nervous system, that you are safe enough to soften. Safety is foundational to renewal, because the human mind cannot replenish itself while bracing against continuous demand. The neuroscientist Stephen Porges, through his polyvagal theory, explains that our physiology is constantly scanning for cues of safety or threat, and environments of relentless expectation keep the body subtly oriented toward defense rather than restoration. When you begin introducing even small cues of safety into your life, whether through supportive relationships, manageable schedules, or moments of intentional quiet, your system gradually learns that it no longer needs to remain on perpetual alert. And from that softening emerges energy, not the frantic energy of adrenaline, but the steady energy of regulation. This is the energy from which meaningful effort arises. It is also the energy that allows ambition to coexist with well-being rather than stand in opposition to it. Many people fear that if they step off the treadmill of constant striving, their lives will somehow lose momentum, yet what often happens instead is that their momentum becomes more directed, less scattered, and therefore far more effective. The business thinker Peter Drucker once noted that there is nothing quite so useless as doing with great efficiency what should not be done at all, a statement that feels particularly relevant when considering how much of modern busyness is devoted to pursuits that add little genuine value. Imagine redirecting even a fraction of that effort toward what truly matters to you. Imagine what becomes possible when your energy is no longer leaking through unnoticed openings. This is not fantasy. It is the natural consequence of living more deliberately. Deliberateness, however, requires courage, because it often asks you to disappoint the version of yourself who believed endurance was the only path to legitimacy. Yet legitimacy rooted in exhaustion is not legitimacy at all. It is merely survival wearing the mask of success. You were made for more than survival. You were made for participation in a life that feels inhabitable. So let this be the moment you begin releasing the harsh interpretation that has followed your fatigue, and consider instead that your tiredness may have been guiding you, patiently and persistently, toward a wiser configuration of your days. Not a smaller life, a truer one. And as this understanding settles more deeply, you may notice something quietly remarkable beginning to return. Not urgency, not pressure, but possibility, the gentle awareness that your future does not have to resemble your past if your awareness is allowed to inform your choices. Transformation rarely announces itself with spectacle. More often, it begins with a shift so internal that no one else immediately sees it, though you feel its presence unmistakably. You begin choosing with greater care. You begin pausing without apology. You begin recognizing that the life you are building must also be livable. And perhaps, in the quiet that follows this recognition, you will realize that what you once named laziness was never indifference, but the intelligence of a system asking to be treated with the same compassion you so readily extend to others. Let that realization remain with you now, not as a conclusion but as an opening, because from here we will continue into the final movement of this audiobook, where recognition matures into embodiment, and where you learn not only to reclaim your energy but to inhabit it with a steadiness that no longer depends on exhaustion for proof of your worth. As this audiobook gently comes to a close, allow yourself a moment to sit with what you have heard rather than rushing back into the noise of the world, because the ideas that truly shape a life are rarely the ones that shock you in an instant, but the ones that remain quietly with you, influencing the way you think, the way you choose, and the way you move through your days long after the narration fades. Let this be the season in which you release the pressure to chase everything, trusting instead that a focused mind, a protected energy, and an intentional direction will carry you much further than exhaustion ever could, because the future is not built by those who scatter themselves across every opportunity, but by those who understand where their presence matters most. If this listening experience gave you clarity, reassurance, or even a single perspective that lightened the way you see your life, consider subscribing to this channel and saving this audiobook, not simply to support the work being created here, but to ensure that you always have a place to return whenever you need calm guidance in a world that rarely slows down. And as this space continues to grow, you will recognize yourself as one of the early listeners who chose depth over distraction and wisdom over urgency. There is something quietly powerful about walking with a voice that reminds you to think deeper, live smarter, and protect the parts of yourself that ambition alone cannot sustain. And in the chapters ahead, we will continue exploring ideas designed to help you build a life that feels not only successful from the outside, but inhabitable from within. Until we meet again, move forward with intention, guard your energy with quiet confidence, and remember that what the world sometimes calls laziness may in fact be wisdom inviting you toward a slower, clearer, and far more meaningful way to live.